Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, early July 1863, Timoth O'Sullivan captures a photograph of the bodies of soldiers killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. This photo, The Harvest of Death, is one of the most famous war photographs in U.S. history. If you don't know the name of the photo or even the name of the photographer, there is a good chance you know this image. Several bodies strewn in the foreground, lying dead on a gentle slope, and then as you look further and further into the photo, more and more bodies receding into the distance. There are a couple people on horseback roaming around in the middle distance, presumably survivors, but even they appear as ghosts in this photograph in a way. And the caption of the photo reads, "Such a picture conveys a useful moral. It shows the blank horror and reality of war in opposition to its pageantry. Here are the dreadful details. Let them aid in preventing such another calamity falling upon the nation." Timoth O'Sullivan is maybe best known for these Civil War photographs, but after the war, he did what many Civil War vets did. He went west. He traveled the frontier, capturing the landscape in a series of mysterious, sometimes forgotten, and always stunning photographs. And now there is a new book from one of my absolute favorite authors about Timoth O'Sullivan and these Western photos. It is called Double Exposure, Resurveying the West with Timoth O'Sullivan, America's Most Mysterious War Photographer. And the author of that book is Robert Sullivan, who has written books like Rats and Meadowlands and A Whale Hunt, tons of brilliant pieces for The New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine. And like a lot of his work, which I adore, this new book is a mix of history, memoir, analysis. It is really great. And it's honestly an honor to have Robert Sullivan on the show to talk about Timoth O'Sullivan. So Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, you do write about Sullivan and O'Sullivan, so we will get into that maybe. You actually write beautifully about that. But here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And Niki's back from some Western traipsing around of her own, so maybe there's some communing to be done with both Bob Sullivan and Timoth O'Sullivan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But you want to start with this photograph, which I think you're right to say. I think most people are right to say is maybe the most famous American war photograph, The Harvest of Death. I tried to describe it not nearly as evocatively as you do, but let's start there. What's O'Sullivan doing at Gettysburg, and how does he come to take this photo?
Yeah, it's July 3rd. The battle has happened. He shows up after the battle to take pictures of the aftermath of war. Really, aftermath for me is a big word. So he makes a bunch of plates, and he makes glass plates. It's a super cumbersome method of photography, an early method of photography, wherein you have this glass plate and you put it in a light-proof box, and then you take it out into the field. And he set it up here on this basically farm field that's been trod by soldiers. So all that corn, all the wheat has been plowed down in a way. And here are the bodies laying in the field. He makes this plate. It was apparently a very hot day. It was humid. He has a couple of choices he can make with this very old kind of photography. Basically, the size of the aperture, that is how much light will be allowed in. And then he has the other choice, which is how long he leaves it open for, how long he exposes the plate. And here's another great word, exposes the plate. All of this photographic stuff allows you to think about these bigger things. So he exposes the plate, and you can see in this particular photo that, yeah, there are dead bodies. And in the distance, there are soldiers, would appear to be officers on horses. And what I think is so amazing about this photo is that the dead are in this excruciating detail, but the living are almost ghost-like.
That's what I find fascinating, is that convergence of technology and meaning in a photograph like this, that photography is not able to capture at this point motion, right? You couldn't get like a fantastic photograph of the action in the middle of the battle because it would just be one big blur, because any sort of motion is going to cause a blur with this technology. The only thing that it is very, very, very good at capturing is stillness. And there's no stillness stiller than death. And so it becomes this like intensely evocative portrait, but then also the technology itself is helping to usher in this change in how war is depicted, because instead of those magisterial paintings and drawings of battles, what you're getting is, as you said, the aftermath, the one place where there's stillness.
And not just sort of like how people are depicting the war, but how people are understanding the war, because this is the first war that has photography in this way, where people can see the actual footage of what's taking place on the battlefield. And it's not this glorious romantic moment in which people are being sort of hailed for their bravery. It's grievous, it's tragedy, it's rampant death. There is nothing really alluring about this image. I mean, and if that's your loved one, it's hard to identify who's on the ground. But to think that that could be your son or your nephew or friend, it really changes the tone and the tenor of how Americans experienced and understood war.
These photographs he makes with another photographer named Alexander Gardner. And Gardner prints a lot of his plates, and this photo and others of Gettysburg, but of the war, will be put into a book that Gardner calls Gardner's Sketchbook of the War, because it's not called the Civil War. And this is, for me, a big thing to recall. And they become a kind of memory book of the war. So how he's trying to get us to think about the war. And all these photos are essentially, I would say, landscape photos. Like they're pictures of the places. And that's another thing. The excruciatingly, horrifying detail of these bodies. It could be a body that could be you. But also, these are showing up too in galleries. They both worked for Matthew Brady, who is the most famous Civil War photographer, though his eyes were weak, and sort of by the end of the war he has trouble seeing, so he always had people photographing for him and often photographing him. Speaking of celebrity and photography, but they will put these plates up in galleries in New York City, and so you can know the news of the war, this visual news of the war.
So to that point, I mean, you wrote a whole book kind of trying to find meaning in these photographs. And I think, as we've been discussing, people do find deep meaning in this. And, the photograph we're sort of hooking this to is called The Harvest of Death. I read from that really evocative caption, which I gather O'Sullivan did not write. But do you have any sense of how much he thought about, I am creating not just a record, I'm not just experimenting with a new technological medium, but moreover, how much does he feel like he's creating something that then people will find a meaning in, find a story in, and find something that will kind of, last for a long time?
So I suppose the reason my book is, I'm just going to say it, probably too long. So, and probably is also, as many of my books are, not a good idea.
You're really selling that pitch.
The reason for both those things is that no, we don't know what O'Sullivan thought making this photo. He cranked out an incredible number of these plates, which are incredibly difficult to do. And if you read the accounts of photographers who were on the road with him and doing similar work, they talk about how hard it is and how your hands are tired and how you can't do this. We know that he worked really hard, and that he was with the two commanders that he surveyed the West with after the war, that he was prized, that he, even if they don't seem to like him so much in the beginning, they begin to realize that he can kind of tell their story in some cases, or at the very least, he's got stuff that for some reason people are interested in. what I'm trying to do is say, well, let's kind of go backwards. Can we undevelop the plates?
Well, I have to ask you, because I just got back from this ranging trip around the West. I was in Taos and Durango and the Grand Canyon and Sedona, all of these landscapes that were entirely new to me and mind-blowing and striking in ways that I really couldn't imagine. I mean, you've hinted that O'Sullivan's career is going to move from what we now call the Civil War to the West. Were O'Sullivan's pictures of that, of the boom towns of the West and of the transformation of the Western landscape, or were they like the kinds of things that I'm associating with the West, which is just like this attempt to capture what looks like wilderness and a kind of untouched landscape, which I think is often what people are, going on hiking trips out west to see today?
Yeah, well, there's so many, for me, interesting answers to that question. Probably why I wrote too much, but but that's also the problem, that there are so many answers to that question. But O'Sullivan took he went on 2 Western surveys, and on one was led by a scientist who would shortly thereafter found the USGS, the U.S. Geologic Survey, and he was a geologist and a scientist, and he became kind of famous for a moment because he broke up a diamond hoax that almost sent the markets into tumble. He was headlined as the man who saved the stock markets from crashing. But the second time he goes out, he's out with an army officer who's secretly funded by Eastern senators to get up mining claims in the West. And so the one guy wants to prove that he's a scientist and, he's finding incredible geologic stuff, which is really interesting. So he wants to tell the scientific story of the West and how the West is a new place geologically as opposed to the East. And that guy he has an eye too to the idea that the indigenous spirit is lovely, but it's fading, and we have to replace them. The second guy, who's basically a crook in the army, leading secret mining tours, he's desperate for a kind of fame that allows him to continue to do this, or just fills his ego. So O'Sullivan takes different kind of pictures. O'Sullivan, I find amazing because he's just a freelance. He's just a guy who does his job, and he does it pretty well. And we can never know what he means in these photos. So then my question becomes, okay, we all know that we think of the West in terms of mining or beautiful vacation landscape. We don't think of it in terms of what it is, which is a community of people who live there and think about living there. And that's all gets erased by these photos. But O'Sullivan, interestingly, comes from a place that is being cleared by another government. O'Sullivan comes from Ireland, which is being land cleared, in a sense, by the British. And so he's photographing people who are being asked to leave their land. And when he photographs the Navajo and what will become the Navajo Nation, they were burnt off their land, forced off their land by the Union Army during the war, the so-called Civil War. But as O'Sullivan photographs them, they have just negotiated a return to their home.
Jeez.
Not the story we think about with the West.
No, not at all.
We have to do an episode on that diamond hoax at some point. So
Yes.
that
Yeah,
hoax is great.
yes.
Someone else. As we wrap up, I mentioned that I am a big fan of your work, and I think in your work you often find yourself. And I mean, I think when you write about rats or the Meadowlands or the sort of places that you've lived and spent time in, I think I see the sort of the reason that you're drawn to it. With this, you go into it in the book, but I'm just curious kind of where you found yourself in this story. I think it's a little less of a clear connection than maybe some of the other work you've done.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're so nice. This was kind of a bad idea to do this book. This just always felt like a bad idea. Your name's Sullivan. It's so confusing. Please stay away from it. But it was just going to be a really quick book for me. It was going to be like a 6-month long project. I'd been to some of the places before, been around them, so I would be able to find the sites. We lived in Oregon for a long time. I'm born on the island of Manhattan, but we lived in my wife's from Oregon. She kind of introduced me to Timoth O'Sullivan when she was in photo school. These old photos were of great interest to people, and people were doing a lot of alternative processes of photography, as they are now too. But anyway, so it would be quick, not a big deal. I just finished a book about the American Revolution, realized nobody cares about the American Revolution. And I was like, okay, Civil War, I think people they talk about that. So just go to the places, be done. But then I got kind of laid up. So to make a long story terribly short, I had to kind of, rethink everything about writing and how to do things. And it took like a year or so to just get back on the road. But in that time, these photos just kept speaking to me. Mm-hmm. Especially there's one of the Salt Lake, and it's just an empty photo of nothing in a way. And I can't believe you could make this picture and satisfy an editor, put it in freelance terms. No way. They'd be like, what is this? No. And yet there's something in these photos that I find, or that I guess you could say like hypothesize or something. There's something about loss or having seen, he was in the war. I started thinking about war photographers I know and being with them and thinking about things they said and about how they carry things, and how when you make art or work, yourself is always in it.
I don't know. There's so much here. It's really a beautiful work, and I'm really glad you spent some time with us talking about it. So, Robert Sullivan is the author. The subject is Timoth O'Sullivan. The book is Double Exposure, Resurveying the West with Timoth O'Sullivan, America's Most Mysterious War Photographer. It is out now. Bob, thank you so much for doing this and come back to talk about the diamond heist or rats, which is Niki's favorite subject.
Not rats.
That is also
Kellie's favorite
Kellie's
subject.
opposed.
We have a running rat theme on this
We have
show,
a lot of
and I
rat
know
episodes.
I hate rats.
Well, I can. I
can go on about
that.
rats.
I like the No, well, I cannot go on about rats too, believe it or not. But thank you so much.
This has been great. No, we really appreciate it. All right, Robert Sullivan, thanks for joining us, and Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.